In the small, racially divided town of Westbridge, a routine traffic stop spirals into a horrific act of brutality when Officer Mason Turner, notorious for his aggressive and racist behavior, beats young Jamal Carter into unconsciousness. As Jamal's life hangs in the balance, the town erupts in protests, and Jamal's mother, Rachel, embarks on a determined quest for justice. But beneath the surface, there are secrets even deeper than the violence. When a mysterious figure from Turner's past emerges, it unravels a shocking truth, one that will force everyone to confront the hidden layers of racism, identity, and self-hatred that shape the town's darkest corners. As the tension mounts and the truth comes to light, no one is prepared for the final twist, a revelation that will shatter everything they thought they knew about justice, redemption, and forgiveness. In the quiet town of Westbridge, tensions simmer just below the surface. When a routine traffic stop turns into a horrific act of brutality, young black man Jamal Carter is left fighting for his life, and the town is thrust into chaos. Officer Mason Turner, notorious for his aggressive and prejudiced actions, is at the center of the storm as calls for justice echo through the streets. Rachel Carter, Jamal's determined mother, refuses to let her son's assault be just another statistic. She demands answers, accountability, and retribution, rallying the community to stand up against police violence. As protests intensify, shocking secrets begin to emerge. Secrets that will not only shake Rachel's faith in the system, but will also unravel the identity of the man responsible for her son's pain. Officer Mason Turner has built his life on maintaining control over the law, his image, and his inner demons. But when a mysterious figure from his past surfaces, his carefully constructed world begins to crumble. In a stunning twist that no one sees coming, Turner's deepest secret is revealed. He is of mixed race, his black heritage buried beneath years of shame and denial. As the truth about Turner's identity unravels, the town is forced to confront its own prejudice, and Rachel must decide if her fight for justice will end in vengeance or forgiveness. Beneath the badge is a gripping, heart-wrenching tale of race, identity, and redemption, where the line between victim and villain is far more complex than anyone imagined. Rachel Carter, a 45-year-old black woman with dark brown skin, dark eyes, and shoulder-length natural hair. She carries herself with quiet strength, her slender frame often dressed in practical yet stylish clothing. A single mother who raised Jamal with love and discipline, Rachel is a nurse who has struggled to provide for her family. She is deeply involved in the community and has always been an advocate for justice, but nothing could prepare her for the day her son became a victim of the very system she sought to trust. Her fierce determination to uncover the truth about Officer Turner propels the story forward. Mason Turner, a tall, stocky man in his 40s with short, graying hair, piercing blue eyes, and a square jaw. He has an authoritative presence, usually dressed in his police uniform or rough civilian clothes. The town's tough, no-nonsense cop, Turner was raised by his white father, a prominent police chief who kept Turner's mixed-race heritage a secret. Turner's mother, a black woman, passed away when he was young, and his father suppressed that part of his identity, leading Turner to internalize racial hatred for himself. As his brutality toward Jamal comes to light, so does his hidden past, forcing him to confront his deep-seated demons. Jamal Carter, a 21-year-old black man with warm brown eyes, short hair, and an athletic build. Jamal's youthful face is often lit by his easygoing smile, though after the attack, his body bears the marks of his trauma. Backstory: a college student with dreams of becoming an engineer, Jamal is well-liked and respected, making the violent attack on him all the more shocking. Raised by his mother to be cautious in a world that often views black men with suspicion, Jamal finds himself at the center of a storm he never expected. His life changes dramatically after the beating, both physically and emotionally. Marcus Daniels, a 50-year-old black man with graying dreadlocks, dark brown eyes, and a tall, lean build. He dresses casually but with a thoughtful touch, usually in jeans and button-down shirts. Marcus is a former civil rights attorney turned community activist. He returns to Westbridge when Rachel asks for help in seeking justice for Jamal. Marcus met Officer Turner's mother, and it is through him that the truth about Turner's hidden past begins to unfold. a small, predominantly white town in the southern United States known for its old-fashioned charm, but with an undercurrent of racial tension. Main Street is lined with quaint shops and restaurants, but on the outskirts are poorer black neighborhoods that feel worlds away from the polished downtown. Westbridge Police Department, a modest brick building with an American flag flying outside. Inside, the walls are adorned with plaques and old photos, a testament to the town's proud law enforcement legacy. It's an intimidating and tightly controlled environment, reflecting the tough attitudes of the officers who work there, including Mason Turner. Rachel Carter's house, a small, cozy two-bedroom home in the black neighborhood of Westbridge. The living room is filled with family photos, and the kitchen is where Rachel finds solace in cooking, often for the local community. Despite its humble size, the house exudes warmth and love, a stark contrast to the violence that threatens her family. The town square, the heart of Westbridge, where the community gathers for events, protests, and town meetings. It features a fountain surrounded by benches, trees, and historic statues, but it also becomes the scene of protests and rising tensions following Jamal's beating. The hospital, a small, underfunded facility where Jamal is rushed after his beating. The sterile, cold hallways contrast with the emotional turmoil that unfolds inside as Rachel and her community rally around Jamal. This becomes an important meeting place for those seeking justice. Mason Turner's family home, a large, traditional Southern home passed down through generations. It is filled with old family photos and memorabilia, but no trace of Turner's Black heritage. The home symbolizes the deep-rooted secrets Turner buried for years, reflecting the facade he maintained in both his public and private life. The calm before the storm. Introduce the characters and set up the inciting incident, Jamal's brutal beating by Officer Turner. The routine drive. Jamal drives home, talking to his mother on the phone. He is pulled over by Officer Turner, who begins acting suspiciously. Officer Turner confronts Jamal, questioning his presence. Jamal's attempts to calm him down only escalate Turner's aggression. Turner orders Jamal out of the car and accuses him of resisting. Turner viciously beats Jamal. The aftermath. Backup officers arrive while Jamal is unconscious. Turner manipulates the situation, controlling the narrative as viewers capture the scene. The phone call. Rachel discovers Jamal's critical condition and rushes to the hospital. She is thrust into a fight for her son's life and justice. The truth uncovered. As the community's outrage grows, Rachel begins her fight for justice. Rachel arrives at the hospital, seeing Jamal in critical condition. Her shock turns to determination as she demands answers. Bystander videos of the beating circulate online. Protests erupt in Westbridge as public opinion turns against Officer Turner. Police Department Statement. The police issue a statement defending Turner's actions. This fuels community anger and Rachel's determination to uncover the truth. Rachel seeks out Marcus Daniels, a former civil rights attorney. Marcus agrees to help, launching an investigation into Officer Turner. Marcus finds inconsistencies in Turner's story. They begin to suspect that Turner is hiding more than just racist tendencies. The investigation deepens, revealing cracks in Turner's story and the town's troubled history. A large protest ensues, with Marcus and Rachel at the forefront. The town becomes increasingly divided as racial tensions rise. Turner reflects on his actions, racked with guilt and confusion. Flashbacks reveal his strained relationship with his father, hinting at his hidden racial identity. A visit to the Turner family home. Rachel and Marcus uncover clues that lead them to Turner's childhood home, confirming that Turner is mixed race. The police chief, Turner's father, attempts to cover up the growing scandal. Result: this raises suspicions within the department, causing further division among the officers. Rachel reconstructs Turner's true heritage. Result: she realizes that the attack on Jamal may have been motivated by Turner's internalized racial hatred. Turner's internal conflict worsens, and Rachel's investigation brings her closer to the truth. Turner becomes increasingly paranoid and guilt-ridden. He lashes out at his fellow officers, his once stoic exterior beginning to crack. Rachel confronts Turner's father at a town hall meeting. Result: the chief denies all allegations, but the meeting raises more questions about the family's secret. Marcus discovers that Turner's father systematically hid his son's black heritage. This knowledge becomes the key to unlocking the truth about Turner's motivations. Jamal's awakening. Jamal briefly regains consciousness in the hospital. He recalls important details of the night, fueling Rachel's determination to take Turner down. A shattered community. The city becomes increasingly divided along racial lines. Violence erupts between protesters and police as the stakes rise for all involved. The climax of the conflict, where secrets are revealed and the truth about Turner comes to light. Turner, racked with guilt, confesses his secret to his best friend. His friend encourages him to confess, but Turner is too afraid of losing everything. Rachel and Marcus confront Turner with evidence of his hidden identity. Turner denies everything at first, but eventually breaks down, confessing his true heritage. Under the pressure of the investigation, Turner's father suffers a heart attack. This leaves Turner without his father's protection, further unraveling his world. News of Turner's mixed-race heritage spreads throughout the city. The town's perception of Turner changes overnight, and many of his supporters turn against him. Jamal's condition worsens, and doctors struggle to save him. The community rallies around Rachel, united in seeking justice for Jamal. The final revelations lead to an unexpected but emotionally powerful resolution. As the evidence against him mounts, Turner is arrested for excessive force and perjury. His once proud career is destroyed, and he faces a trial that could change everything. Despite Turner's downfall, Rachel is torn between seeking revenge and understanding Turner's pain. Marcus encourages her to fight for justice, but Rachel hesitates, feeling conflicted. The town holds a town meeting to address the aftermath of Turner's arrest. Old wounds resurface as the community grapples with the racism deeply rooted in its core. Turner, now broken and remorseful, seeks to make amends. He tries to reach out to Rachel, offering an apology, but she refuses to meet with him. In the courtroom, as Turner is being sentenced, Jamal's medical condition suddenly improves, and he regains full consciousness. This unexpected recovery leads to an emotional scene in which Rachel and Jamal decide to forgive Turner, setting a powerful example for the town. The story ends with a sense of hope for healing and redemption. The calm before the storm. The routine drive. Jamal Carter tapped his fingers rhythmically on the steering wheel as he navigated the winding roads of Westbridge. The night was quiet, the distant hum of crickets and the occasional passing car the only sounds breaking the silence. His phone, securely attached to the dashboard, buzzed with a familiar tone. A smile tugged at his lips as he answered the call. "Hey, Mom. I'm on my way home," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. On the other end of the line, Rachel Carter's voice filled the small car. "You better not stay out too late. You have that interview tomorrow, remember?" Jamal chuckled softly. "I didn't forget. I'm ready. I just want to get a good night's sleep first." Rachel's tone softened. "I'm proud of you. You know that?" "Yeah, Mom. I know." The familiar conversation felt like a balm against the tension he sometimes carried. Westbridge wasn't exactly known for being welcoming to young black men who were passing through town at night. Jamal had learned to be cautious, to keep his head down, and to be polite if confronted by the police. His mother had drilled that into him for years. But tonight, he felt at ease. As he approached an intersection, Jamal noticed a flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. The police car behind him had turned on its siren. His heart sank and his fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Mom," Jamal said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I think I'm going to get pulled over." On the other end of the line, Rachel's voice immediately filled with concern. "What? Why? You weren't speeding, were you?" "No, I don't think so. I'll call you back, okay?" Jamal ended the call, his pulse quickening as the police car pulled up behind him. He sighed, already running through the mental checklist his mother had taught him. Keep your hands visible, stay calm, don't argue. Officer Mason Turner approached the car slowly, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Jamal kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, the window already rolled down. "Good evening, officer," Jamal said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. Turner, a tall man with broad shoulders and a face hardened by years of policing, didn't return the pleasantries. His piercing blue eyes flickered over Jamal suspiciously. "License and registration," Turner called out, his tone cold. Jamal quickly complied, handing over his documents. "Was I speeding, sir?" Turner ignored the question, studying Jamal's license for a long moment before speaking again. "What are you doing out so late?" "I'm heading home from a study group," Jamal replied, keeping his tone respectful. Turner leaned closer, the faint scent of aftershave and authority mingling in the night air. "Are you from around here?" Jamal nodded. "Yes, sir. I live a few streets away." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Get out of the car." Jamal hesitated. "Is there any reason to?" "I said, get out of the car," Turner repeated, his voice stronger this time. Jamal's stomach churned as he slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. He knew he shouldn't resist, but something about Turner's demeanor unsettled him. As he stepped out of the car, the cool night air hit his skin, and he instinctively raised his hands slightly to show he wasn't a threat. Turner circled him, his flashlight flickering over Jamal's body as if searching for something, anything, to justify his assault. "You seem nervous," Turner commented, the suspicion in his voice growing. "I'm not," Jamal lied, his pulse racing. Without warning, Turner grabbed Jamal's arm and wrenched it behind his back, slamming him against the hood of the car. "Stop resisting," Turner yelled, though Jamal wasn't resisting. "Wait, I'm not." Jamal's words were cut off by the tightness of the officer's grip. Panic surged through him as he felt the cold metal of the handcuffs snap against his wrists. Turner's baton appeared in his hand like a weapon ready to strike. "You think you can play with me?" Turner hissed, his face close to Jamal's ear. "I'm not doing anything," Jamal yelled, his voice thick with fear. But Turner was beyond reasoning. The baton came down hard on Jamal's side, pain exploding in his ribs. Jamal gasped, his knees buckling as another blow slammed into his back. The world spun, and all he could hear was the sound of Turner's screams and the distant pounding of his own heart. Resisting arrest. Turner screamed again, though Jamal had long since stopped moving. The night, once peaceful and silent, was now filled with violence. Jamal's vision blurred as he fell to the ground, his body bruised and broken. Turner. Red and blue lights flashed across the empty road as backup arrived. 2 additional officers emerged from their vehicles, surveying the scene. Jamal, nearly unconscious on the ground, and Turner, standing over him, his expression grim but composed. "What happened here?" one of the officers asked, his tone filled with disbelief. Turner pointed his baton at Jamal's prone form. "Resisting arrest. I had to take him down." The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. Turner's reputation preceded him, and none of them were willing to question his version of events, even if something didn't feel right to them. In the distance, a small group of onlookers had gathered, some holding up their phones, recording the scene. The glow from the phone cameras looked like eyes watching the truth unfold, but Turner remained unfazed. He had done this before, twisted a narrative, controlled the outcome. "Call an ambulance," Turner ordered. "Get him out of here." As the paramedics arrived and carried Jamal's unconscious body onto a stretcher, Turner straightened his uniform, his gaze cool and distant. He would handle this situation, as he always had. Jamal would be portrayed as the aggressor, and Turner would walk away unharmed. Across town, Rachel Carter's phone vibrated in her hand. She was pacing the living room, waiting for Jamal to return her call. The moment the screen lit up with an unfamiliar number, her heart sank. "Hello?" she answered, her voice shaking. "Mrs. Carter? This is Westbridge Hospital. Your son has been admitted." Rachel's world stopped. The words blurred together, but one sentence cut through like a knife. "Critical condition." The phone slipped from her hand as she scrambled to grab her keys. Her mind raced, her heart pounding as she drove toward the hospital. The image of her son, lying there and injured, flashed before her eyes. She had raised him to be cautious, to be careful in a world that wasn't always kind to young black men. But now the system had failed him in the worst possible way. The sterile smell of disinfectant hit Rachel the moment she pushed through the hospital doors. The bright, fluorescent lights only added to her growing nausea. Her hands were trembling, and her pulse raced as she approached the front desk. Every step felt as though it carried the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. She couldn't shake the image of Jamal's name on the caller ID, followed by the cold voice telling her that her son was in critical condition. "I'm looking for my son, Jamal Carter. He was brought here tonight," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words catching in her throat. The nurse behind the desk, a tired woman in her 50s, glanced up and nodded. "Just a moment." Rachel's foot tapped impatiently against the tile floor, her anxiety gnawing at her. After what felt like an eternity, the nurse returned with grim news. "He's in surgery right now. It was touch and go for a while, but the doctors are doing everything they can." Rachel's world narrowed into a tunnel of fear. "Can I see him?" "Not yet, I'm afraid, but you can wait just down the hall. The doctor will update you as soon as there's news." Rachel's legs felt like they would give out from under her as she made her way to the waiting room. The small room was filled with cold chairs and outdated magazines, none of which offered any comfort. She collapsed into one of the chairs, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. Jamal was careful, always respectful. How could something like this happen to him? As she sat there, her mind raced with questions. What had he done to deserve this? She knew her son. Jamal wouldn't have resisted, wouldn't have given anyone a reason to hurt him. Her thoughts were interrupted when the door opened and a doctor, his scrubs stained and his face lined with exhaustion, stepped into the room. "Mrs. Carter?" Rachel stood quickly, her eyes wide with hope and terror. "Is my son going to be okay?" The doctor hesitated before speaking. "He's stable for now. We were able to stop the bleeding, but he's in a medically induced coma. His injuries were severe. We're monitoring him closely, but the next 24 hours are critical." Rachel's heart sank. The words medically induced coma echoed in her head, drowning out everything else. Her son, her baby, was lying somewhere in this hospital, fighting for his life because of one man's actions. "I need to see him," Rachel said, her voice firmer now. The doctor nodded. "I'll take you to him." Hours passed in a blur. Rachel sat at Jamal's bedside, his hand limp in hers, as the steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room. His face was bruised, swollen, barely recognizable beneath the layers of bandages and tubes. She had never felt so helpless in her life. She checked her phone absent-mindedly, scrolling through messages from concerned friends and family. But one message stood out, sent by a friend with the simple text, "Have you seen this?" Rachel clicked the link, and her screen was filled with the grainy video of her son's beating. A shaky phone recording captured the moment Officer Turner dragged Jamal from his car, the brutal strikes of his baton, the way Jamal crumpled to the ground like a discarded rag doll. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the footage looped again and again, the horror of it too much to comprehend. She stared at the screen, tears blurring her vision. The video had been posted online and was spreading like wildfire. Thousands of comments flooded in, demanding justice, calling for accountability. But Rachel couldn't focus on the outcry. All she could see was her son, helpless, brutalized, his life forever changed by that single night. The next morning, Rachel stepped outside the hospital for fresh air, her eyes squinting against the harsh sunlight. A crowd had gathered at the entrance, news vans, reporters, and community members holding signs that read justice for Jamal and end police brutality. The air was thick with anger, and the sounds of shouting filled the streets of Westbridge. Rachel hadn't expected the protest to grow so quickly, but the video had galvanized the community. People she had never met before were rallying for her son, demanding that Officer Turner be held accountable for what he'd done. The town square, once a place of casual gatherings and local events, had become the epicenter of a movement. As Rachel watched, she saw familiar faces among the crowd, people from her church, her neighborhood. Even Marcus Daniels, a former civil rights lawyer turned activist, stood at the center, leading chants and urging calm. Marcus caught her eye and walked over, his expression serious. "Rachel, I'm so sorry about what happened to Jamal," he said, his voice full of compassion. "I've already spoken with the local news. This protest is growing, and we're going to make sure that Turner is held responsible." Rachel nodded, her emotions raw. "Thank you, Marcus. I don't know what to do. I just want justice for my son." "You're not alone," Marcus said, "but you'll need legal help, and we have to act fast. Turner is already trying to spin the story. We can't let him control the narrative." The next day, Rachel and Marcus watched the news from the hospital's waiting room. The Westbridge Police Department had issued a public statement about the incident. Officer Turner was being praised for his courage under pressure and his swift action in the face of resistance. The department had launched an internal investigation, but no charges had been filed. Rachel's blood boiled as she listened to the lies. Turner had painted Jamal as the aggressor, twisting the events of that night to justify his brutality. "They're trying to protect him," Rachel muttered, her hands clenched into fists. "They're protecting him like they always do." Marcus nodded grimly. "We knew this would happen, but we're not going to let them sweep this under the rug. I've already started gathering witness statements, and we're filing a formal lawsuit against Turner and the department." Rachel looked at Marcus, her heart aching with gratitude. He was right. They couldn't stop now. Not when the truth was being buried. Later that evening, Rachel returned to Jamal's side. She watched his chest rise and fall with the rhythm of the ventilator, his body still battered and broken. She wasn't the same woman who had rushed to the hospital in a panic. That woman had been scared, overwhelmed by grief and fear. Now, Rachel was angry. Angry that the system had failed her son. Angry that the man responsible for his suffering was still walking free, and angry that the truth was being twisted to protect those in power. She wouldn't let Jamal's suffering be in vain. She would fight for him, for their family, for the justice they deserved. The door to the hospital room creaked open, and Marcus stepped inside, holding a folder full of legal documents. "I've got everything ready. We're going to take this to court," he said quietly, his eyes meeting Rachel's. Rachel stood, squaring her shoulders. "Let's do this." Together, they left the hospital room, knowing that the fight ahead would be long and painful. But Rachel was ready. She would stop at nothing to bring Officer Turner to justice, and she wouldn't rest until her son's name was cleared. As they stepped into the night air, the sounds of the protests outside filled the streets. The fight for justice had only just begun. The once quiet town square was now a storm of voices. Rachel stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart pounding as chants of "Justice for Jamal" echoed off the buildings. Signs waved in the air, angry declarations demanding accountability, equality, and an end to police brutality. The peaceful town of Westbridge had never seen anything like this, and Rachel was still trying to wrap her head around it all. At the center of the chaos stood Marcus Daniels, his voice booming through a megaphone. He was a natural leader, his words calculated and strong, designed to stir the crowd and channel their anger into a united force. "We will not be silent. We will not back down," Marcus shouted, raising a clenched fist. The crowd responded with a roar of approval, their energy palpable. Rachel's eyes scanned the crowd, and for a moment, the magnitude of it all hit her. Her son's name was on everyone's lips. Strangers were fighting for him, for justice. But beneath the surface of that pride, she felt a growing knot of fear. What if this wasn't enough? What if the system that had allowed this to happen never changed? As Marcus continued to rally the crowd, Rachel felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Linda, her neighbor and longtime friend, standing beside her. "Rachel, it's incredible how many people have come out," Linda said softly. "We're all here for you." Rachel nodded, blinking back tears. "I just want justice for Jamal. That's all I want." "You'll get it," Linda assured her, but the look in her eyes was conflicted, mirroring the doubt that had taken root in Rachel's heart. A few miles away, Officer Mason Turner sat in his dimly lit kitchen, staring at the untouched dinner on the table in front of him. His hands trembled as he clasped them together, his jaw clenched tightly. The shouting from the protests echoed faintly in the distance, like a ghost haunting his every thought. He couldn't escape it, not at the station, not at home, not even in his own mind. Everywhere he turned, there were reminders of what he had done. It had been weeks since the incident, but the memory of Jamal's body crumpling beneath his blows played on repeat in his head. Each time, it felt more brutal, more savage, and more unforgivable. But it wasn't just the physical act that ate away at him. It was the guilt that followed. A guilt rooted in something deeper than his badge, deeper than his duty as a cop. It was rooted in who he was, in the lie he had lived his entire life. Turner's phone buzzed on the kitchen table. He glanced at the screen. It was his father, the retired police chief. His father had called 3 times that day already, but Turner hadn't answered. The old man wanted to protect him, to shield him from the fallout. But Turner didn't want that. He didn't deserve that. Not after what he had done. His thoughts drifted back to his mother, to the secret his father had buried so long ago. The secret that was now beginning to unravel everything. Turner slammed his fist on the table, the anger and confusion swirling inside him like a storm. He couldn't keep running from the truth, but he didn't know how to face it either. Rachel and Marcus stood in front of the large, traditional Southern home that had once belonged to the Turner family. The house was quiet now, its windows dark and its front porch empty. It had been years since anyone had lived there, but Marcus had a key. He had known Turner's mother before she passed, and her story had become part of the town's forgotten history. "This is where it all started," Marcus said, his voice low as they walked up the steps. Turner's mother, she was black, but his father, he did everything he could to hide that fact from the world. Rachel frowned, her heart heavy with the implications. So, all this time, Turner's been hiding his own identity? Marcus nodded, pushing open the door. He was raised to hate the very thing he is. His father was ashamed of his heritage, and he passed that shame down to Mason. They stepped inside, the air musty and still. Old photos lined the walls, the faces of Turner's ancestors staring back at them. Rachel paused in front of a portrait of a young woman, her skin dark and her expression proud. "Is this her?" Rachel asked. Marcus nodded. "That's Turner's mother." Rachel stared at the portrait, a flood of emotions washing over her. How could someone be so consumed by self-hatred that they turned it outward, onto others, onto her son? As they moved through the house, they found more clues, letters, photographs, and mementos that painted a picture of a family divided by race and prejudice. It was clear that Turner had been caught in the middle of that division his whole life, forced to live a lie that had finally consumed him. "This is the truth," Marcus said quietly, holding up an old letter from Turner's father. "And it's going to change everything." Back at the Westbridge Police Department, the atmosphere was tense. The internal investigation into Turner's actions was underway, but it was clear to everyone that the higher-ups were doing everything in their power to protect one of their own. At the helm of that effort was Turner's father, the retired chief, who still wielded considerable influence within the department. "He's under a lot of pressure," one of the officers muttered as they passed Turner's office. "But you know the chief. He'll do whatever it takes to keep Mason safe." Inside his office, Turner sat with his head in his hands. His father had visited him earlier that day, urging him to stay quiet, to follow the department's lead. "We'll get through this," his father had said, "but you need to let me handle it." But Turner wasn't sure he could trust his father anymore. The lies, the cover-ups, the years of denial, they had all led to this moment. And now, as the walls closed in on him, Turner realized that the only way out was through the truth. Later that night, Rachel sat in her living room, surrounded by the documents and photos they had gathered from Turner's family home. The weight of it all pressed down on her, and she struggled to make sense of it. Her son had been beaten within an inch of his life by a man who was, in many ways, a victim of the same system that had failed Jamal. A man who had been taught to hate his own identity, to bury the truth of who he was. Rachel's thoughts raced as she flipped through the letters. The anger she felt for Turner was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, pity. Pity for a man who had never been allowed to embrace his true self. A man who had spent his whole life running from the very thing he was. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just about justice for Jamal anymore. It was about breaking a cycle of hatred and shame that had been passed down through generations. But how could she fight for her son's justice while also acknowledging the brokenness in the man who had hurt him? Rachel glanced at the clock. Tomorrow, she and Marcus would confront Turner with what they had found. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted vengeance or something else entirely. Officer Mason Turner sat in his patrol car, the engine idling as his hands gripped the steering wheel. It was late, and the darkness outside the window mirrored the storm brewing inside him. The weight of his actions, of the lies, and of the truth he'd buried for so long pressed down on him until it was almost suffocating. He hadn't planned to stop at the scene where the protest was raging in the town square, but the sound of voices carried through the air like a siren's call. He could hear the chants, the anger, the cries for justice. His own name was on their lips, echoing in a town that had once seen him as a hero. But he wasn't a hero. He knew that now. His mind raced, each thought darker than the last. He had been raised to believe in the law, in order, and in the version of truth his father had crafted for him. But now, as everything he had built crumbled around him, Mason wasn't sure who he was anymore. The protests, the viral video of Jamal's beating, the investigation, it was all closing in on him. But what haunted him most wasn't the anger from the crowd or the whispers of his colleagues. It was his own guilt, gnawing at him like a disease he couldn't cure. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from outside the car, jolting him out of his thoughts. A protester had thrown something, a rock, maybe, against the windshield. Mason watched as the glass spiderwebbed with cracks, but his hands stayed frozen on the wheel. He didn't flinch. He didn't react. Because inside, he was already broken. Rachel Carter had never felt this kind of determination before. She had spent weeks fighting for her son, but now it was time to confront the man who had enabled all of this to happen. Turner's father, the retired police chief. The town hall meeting was crowded, the tension thick in the air. Rachel stood at the back of the room, watching as the former police chief held court with the city officials, his influence still palpable despite his retirement. He looked the same as he had when she had first moved to Westbridge, stern, powerful, and untouchable. But today, Rachel wasn't afraid. When the meeting opened for public comments, she wasted no time. She stood tall, her voice unwavering as she called out the former chief. "Chief Turner," Rachel said, her voice carrying across the room. "You've spent your entire career protecting this town, but you've also spent it protecting your son from the consequences of his actions. You've hidden the truth, buried it deep, but it's time for the truth to come out." The room fell silent, all eyes on Rachel. Turner's father stood, his face stony, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or maybe guilt. He had always controlled the narrative, but now that control was slipping through his fingers. "I don't know what you're talking about," the chief said coldly. "My son has served this town with honor." Rachel took a step forward, her heart pounding. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. You hid his black heritage. You raised him to hate himself, to hate what he is. And now that hatred has destroyed my son's life." There were gasps from the crowd, murmurs rippling through the room. Rachel's words were a dagger, and the chief knew it. His face flushed red as he opened his mouth to respond, but Rachel didn't give him the chance. "You've protected him long enough," she said. "But you can't protect him from the truth." The room was electric with tension as Chief Turner's facade finally began to crack. For decades, he had been the symbol of order and authority in Westbridge, the man who upheld the law and kept the town safe. But now, as Rachel's words pierced through his armor, he felt something unraveling inside him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling as he addressed the crowd. "I did what I had to do. My son, he didn't ask for this. He didn't deserve to be caught between two worlds." But his words rang hollow. The crowd wasn't buying it. They had seen the video of Jamal's beating, and they had heard enough stories about Mason Turner's actions over the years to know that the former chief had covered up more than just his son's identity. Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Caught between two worlds? You mean the one where he could be himself, and the one where you forced him to be something he wasn't? You made him hide who he was, and now an innocent young man is paying the price." The chief faltered, his gaze falling to the floor. He had always believed that burying the truth would protect his son, but now, in the cold light of reality, he could see the destruction it had caused. He had failed not just Mason, but the entire community. "I was trying to protect him," the chief said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel shook her head, her heart heavy. "You weren't protecting him. You were protecting yourself." Later that evening, Marcus and Rachel waited outside the police station. Inside, Officer Mason Turner was sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. The weight of everything, the lies, the guilt, the truth, had finally become too much for him to bear. Rachel didn't know what to expect when she confronted him. She had spent so many sleepless nights imagining what she would say to the man who had hurt her son. But now that she was here, standing just outside the door, all of that rage felt far away. When they entered, Turner didn't look up. He didn't move at all, his broad shoulders slumped, his once proud posture broken. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to hurt him like that." Rachel took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You almost killed my son." "I know," Turner whispered, finally lifting his head to meet her gaze. His eyes were filled with something Rachel hadn't expected. Regret? "I spent my whole life hiding from who I am," Turner continued. "My father, he made sure of that. And I became someone else. Someone who didn't care. Someone who took out all of that anger on people like Jamal." Rachel's hands clenched into fists. "Why? Why my son?" Turner shook his head, his face pale. "Because he reminded me of everything I hated about myself." The words hung in the air like a confession from a man who had nothing left to lose. And maybe that was true. Mason Turner had spent his life running from his identity, but now, at the end of the road, there was nowhere left to hide. The next morning, Turner's confession made headlines. He had been arrested on charges of excessive force and perjury, and the town was reeling from the fallout. The protests had only grown louder, but now there was a shift in the air, something closer to hope than anger. As Rachel stood outside the courthouse, watching the crowd gather, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. Justice was finally being served, but it wasn't just about the arrest. It was about the truth that had been buried for so long, and the truth that had finally come to light. She glanced over at Marcus, who stood beside her, a small smile on his face. "We did it," he said softly. Rachel nodded, but her thoughts were still with her son. Jamal had survived the attack, but he wasn't the same boy she had known before. The scars ran deep, both physical and emotional, but she knew they would heal in time. As the doors to the courthouse opened and Mason Turner was led out in handcuffs, Rachel felt a strange mixture of emotions. She had fought for justice, and now that it had come, she wasn't sure what to feel. But one thing was certain: Westbridge would never be the same again.